Pennsylvania, 1943. A gray-haired retired schoolteacher sits at her writing desk and pens her 8th complaint letter to the County Board of Supervisors. Her penmanship is flawless, the kind that belongs in a Palmer Method textbook. Her phrasing is precise as legal briefs. She seals the envelope, walks it to the post office, drops it in the outgoing mail slot. 3 days later, the letter vanishes. It never reaches its destination, never returns to sender. It simply ceases to exist, as though it had never been written at all. That's when she understands. Complaining is futile. She needs to teach people to complain for themselves. And so she begins her lessons. Officially, it's adult literacy classes for the uneducated. Penmanship, spelling, composition. But in reality, every exercise, every dictation is a blueprint for writing the perfect complaint. The War Production Board coordinator doesn't notice at first. When he does, it's too late. Because the old school teacher has already taught not 10 or 20 people. She's taught an entire town to write in a way that can't be stopped. But the price of this lesson will be more terrible than anyone could have imagined. The town of Ashford Hollow sat in a valley between two ridges, like a forgotten egg in a stone nest. 300 households, a Methodist church with a leaking steeple, a town hall in a former merchant's house, and a War Production Board office painted in cheerful government green that had already blistered and faded to a sickly olive. The roads here weren't paved, water came from wells, electricity was unreliable, and life ran according to laws older than any federal authority. People here knew who to defer to, who to fear, and what to keep quiet about. Estelle Vogel knew this better than most. She was 67 years old, 43 of which she'd spent as a schoolteacher at Ashford Hollow Elementary. She remembered the Great War, Prohibition, the Depression, the Dust Bowl refugees who'd passed through heading west, and everything that came after. She'd seen presidents come and go, slogans change, fears shift, but one thing remained constant. In any system, there were those who took more than their share, and those who stayed silent because fear was wiser than speaking. The War Production Board coordinator for Ashford Hollow and the surrounding townships was Elwood Percival Whitmore, a man of 45 with a face like a clenched fist and a voice that could silence a county fair. He'd risen to power 5 years ago, in 1938, after the previous coordinator had died suddenly of a heart attack. Elwood was local, knew every family, every dirt road, every weakness. He wasn't openly cruel. He was smart. He understood that power didn't rest on fear, but on dependency. To one farmer, he allocated extra seed from the agricultural reserve. To another, he extended the lease on grazing land. To a third, he helped get a son exempted from the draft for essential farm work. And in return, he took. Not everything at once, little by little. The best apples from the victory gardens went not to the war effort, but to his root cellar. Choice hogs didn't go to the army quartermaster, but to his smokehouse. Honey, preserves, cheese, bacon, everything of quality ended up in his possession, while the ledgers showed them as spoiled, lost to pests, or stolen by unknown persons. Everyone knew. No one spoke. Estelle Vogel had retired 3 years ago, in 1940. She was 64 then, and by law entitled to her rest. But she didn't know how to rest. Without school, without students, without the bell dividing the day into lessons, she felt like a tree without roots. So when she was asked to teach evening adult literacy classes, she accepted immediately. The literacy program was officially aimed at combating illiteracy. There were still older men and women in town who couldn't read or write. Some could barely scratch their names. Estelle taught them the alphabet, penmanship, simple sentences. Classes met 3 evenings a week in the same schoolhouse where she'd taught her entire life, in a small classroom on the ground floor. She wrote her first complaint in early summer of 1943. The trigger was an incident with the town's honey production. Ashford Hollow had 12 productive apiaries scattered across the hillsides, part of the war effort to provide sweetener since sugar was strictly rationed. In June, when the honey harvest was at its peak, Elwood issued an order redirecting half the production to __quote _0 __. In reality, this meant the honey went to private warehouses, where it was sold on the black market in Pittsburgh at prices incomparable to government rates. Estelle knew about this because her nephew Harold worked as foreman at one of the larger apiaries. He told her, shamefaced and staring at his boots, that half the honey was being trucked away at night to unknown destinations, while the ledgers showed it as __quote _1 _. Harold couldn't do anything about it. He had a wife, 3 children, and an aging mother depending on him. If he opened his mouth, he'd be fired, and finding other work in the county would be impossible. Everyone knew Elwood controlled the district. Cross him, and you crossed everyone. But Estelle Vogel was different. She had no children. Her husband had died at Belleau Wood in 1918. She had no relatives except Harold and his family. She had nothing to lose except her conscience. And so she sat down to write. The complaint was composed by every rule, addressed to the County Board of Supervisors, copied to the district attorney, copied to the State War Production Board office in Harrisburg. Estelle laid out the facts, dates, quantities, names of witnesses. She didn't accuse directly. She requested an investigation. Her tone was respectful, her style businesslike. 43 years of teaching had taught her to write in a way that couldn't be faulted. She took the letter to the post office. The office occupied a corner of the town hall building. The postmistress was Mabel Hendricks, a woman of about 50, perpetually tired, with hands roughened from sorting parcels. Estelle handed her the envelope, paid for the stamp, received a receipt. Everything proper. A week passed. No response. 2 weeks. Silence. Estelle wrote a second complaint, then a third, a fourth. Each time the same procedure: post office, Mabel, envelope, receipt. And each time, nothing. After the 7th complaint, Estelle decided to test the system. She wrote a letter to a former colleague in Philadelphia, a teacher she'd worked with years ago. The letter arrived in 5 days. The response came back within a week. The mail was working fine. That's when she understood. Her complaints were disappearing. Someone was intercepting them before they left town. That night, Estelle sat for a long time by her window, looking out at the dark ridges. She could have given up. No one would have blamed her. She was old. Her health was failing. She was alone. What business was the town's honey to her? But something inside her, something stubborn and unbending, refused to be silent. She'd spent her entire life teaching children about honesty, justice, truth. And now, at the end, she couldn't betray what she'd taught. If complaints didn't reach their destination, she needed to change tactics. If one complaint didn't work, she needed 100 complaints. If they could stop her alone, let them try to stop 100 people. The next day in her literacy class, Estelle announced a new topic: business correspondence. There were 12 people in the class, 8 women and 4 men, ages ranging from 30 to 70, all from poor families who hadn't had the opportunity for schooling as children. They came here to learn to sign their names on documents, read the newspaper, write letters to relatives. Estelle taught them patiently, without mockery, as she'd once taught her first graders. Today we're going to learn to write official letters, she said, distributing clean sheets of paper to the desks. This is an important skill. Every American citizen should know how to address government agencies when they see something wrong. The students exchanged glances. Something wrong was a dangerous phrase in wartime. Estelle wrote on the blackboard, "Letter to the County Board of Supervisors." Then she dictated a template. How to begin, how to state facts, how to close. She explained calmly, methodically, as she'd explained verb conjugations. No agitation, no revolutionary rhetoric, just an English composition lesson. But the examples she used were pointed. Imagine, she said, that you work at one of the apiaries. You see that part of the honey harvest is disappearing. You want to report this to the authorities. How would you write it? Let's try. She guided their hands as she'd once guided children through cursive practice, letter by letter, word by word. Quote 4, quote 5, quote 6. The students wrote earnestly, tongues poking from the corners of their mouths like school children. They didn't understand that their teacher was doing something dangerous. To them, it was just penmanship practice. But Estelle knew. She was planting seeds. Sooner or later, one of them would use this knowledge. Someone would write a real complaint. And then another. And another. And then the flood would be impossible to stop. The first to write was Luther. Luther Finch was 37 years old. He worked at one of the hillside apiaries, tending the hives. It was quiet, solitary work, far from public view. Luther lived in a small shack near the hives, almost a hermit. His wife had died in childbirth 10 years ago. The baby hadn't survived. Since then, Luther had withdrawn into himself, spoke little, avoided people. But he came to the literacy classes. Not because he was illiterate. He could read and write, albeit with many errors. He came because it was the only place where he felt valued. Estelle never laughed at his scrawled letters, always corrected him gently with respect. In mid-July, 3 weeks after she'd started the business correspondence lessons, Luther came to Estelle's house. It was late morning, the heat already pressing down on the valley like a stone weight. Estelle sat in the shade of her grape arbor, drinking cold tea. "Miss Vogel," Luther said quietly, standing at her gate, "I wrote one, like you taught us." She looked up. "Wrote what, Luther?" "A complaint. About Mr. Whitmore. He took all the honey from our apiary. All of it. Every last jar. The ledger says the bees got sick, poor harvest. But we had 200 pounds. 200, Miss Vogel. I worked nights nursing those hives, keeping them healthy. And it all went to him." Luther held out a folded sheet of paper. It was creased, the handwriting rough, but the text was properly structured, by all the rules she'd taught. Addressee, statement of facts, signature. "Have you sent it?" she asked. "Taking it to the post office tomorrow. Wanted to show you first. Did I write it right?" "You wrote it perfectly, Luther. Well done." He nodded and left. Estelle watched him go and felt equal parts pride and fear. Pride because her lesson had worked. Fear because now something had started that couldn't be stopped. Luther mailed his letter the next day. 2 days later, Mabel Hendricks mentioned to Elwood Whitmore over coffee at the town diner that quote, _7__. Elwood didn't react visibly. He thanked Mabel, paid for her coffee, and left. That evening, Luther's shack burned down. The fire marshal ruled it an accident. Faulty kerosene heater. Luther wasn't home at the time. He'd been working late at the hives. He lost everything. His few possessions, his books, his late wife's photographs. But he didn't lose his resolve. He wrote another letter. This time, he mailed it from the next town over, 12 miles away, where Mabel's reach didn't extend. 3 weeks later, a county inspector arrived in Ashford Hollow unannounced. He spent 2 days examining ledgers, interviewing apiary workers, inspecting honey stores. He found discrepancies. Not enough to prosecute, but enough to note. He filed a report recommending closer oversight of local war production board operations. Nothing came of it immediately, but the word spread. Someone had complained, and an inspector had come. The system could work. Estelle's next class had 16 students. Word had gotten around. People who could already read and write showed up, ostensibly to brush up their skills. Estelle knew what they really wanted. She taught them composition, grammar, the proper way to address officials. She taught them how to make a complaint impossible to ignore. Second to write was Agnes. Agnes Holloway was 43, a widow with 2 teenage sons. She worked in the town's canning plant, which processed Victory Garden produce for military shipments. The plant was supposed to can tomatoes, beans, corn, whatever the gardens produced. But Agnes noticed that the best produce never made it into cans marked for military distribution. It was diverted to unlabeled containers that left the plant at night on unmarked trucks. She told Estelle about it after class one evening. Estelle listened, asked questions, took no notes. 2 days later, Agnes submitted a detailed complaint to the State Agricultural Board, copied to the county prosecutor. Her letter made it through. Whether by luck or because the state office was beyond Mabel's network, it reached its destination. An auditor arrived within a month. He found irregularities in the canning plant's production records. He couldn't prove black market sales, but he could prove mismanagement. The plant supervisor was transferred to a less sensitive position. A new supervisor was appointed with strict oversight instructions. Third was Raymond, a worker at the town's small dairy cooperative. Fourth was Stella, who'd noticed that ration coupons distributed by Elwood's office were fewer than the allotment chart specified. Fifth was Thomas, a farmer whose wheat quota was recorded as delivered, but had actually been diverted elsewhere. One by one, Estelle's students wrote their letters, and one by one, the letters made their way into the system. Some were intercepted. Some got through. But enough got through that the pattern became visible to anyone paying attention. By autumn of 1943, the county board had received 17 complaints originating from Ashford Hollow, all written in remarkably similar format, all alleging irregularities in war production board operations under Elwood Whitmore's supervision. Elwood knew where this was coming from. He'd learned about Estelle's literacy classes, about the business correspondence curriculum. He understood what she was doing. He went to see her one October evening, arriving at her small house just as dusk was settling over the valley. Estelle was in her kitchen, preparing a simple dinner. She heard the knock, knew who it would be. She opened the door. Elwood stood there, hat in hand, his expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Vogel," he said, "may I come in?" She stepped aside. He entered, removed his hat, but didn't sit when she gestured to a chair. "I think you know why I'm here," he said. "I expect I do. These letters, these complaints, they're causing problems. For the town, for the war effort, disrupting operations, bringing in inspectors, creating distrust." "If operations are honest," Estelle said evenly, "inspectors won't find anything wrong." "You're putting ideas in people's heads," Elwood said, his voice hardening, "teaching them to question authority. During wartime. That's dangerous, Mrs. Vogel. That borders on sedition." "I'm teaching them to read and write," Estelle replied. "And I'm teaching them their rights as American citizens. That's not sedition, Mr. Whitmore. That's civics. You're teaching them to bite the hand that feeds them. I'm teaching them that the hand shouldn't be stealing from the plate." They stood facing each other in the dim kitchen, two people locked in a battle that was about far more than honey and ration coupons. "You should be careful," Elwood said quietly. "You're an old woman, living alone. Things can happen. Accidents." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Whitmore?" "I'm advising you, as a concerned neighbor." Estelle smiled, a thin, cold smile. "I'm 67 years old, Mr. Whitmore. I've survived the Spanish flu, the Depression, and losing my husband to the Kaiser's artillery. I'm not afraid of you." "You should be," Elwood said. He put his hat back on, turned, and left. Estelle closed the door, leaned against it, and allowed herself to tremble. She wasn't afraid of dying, but she was afraid of failing, of stopping before the work was done. The next week, she held a special class. 22 people attended. She taught them about documentation, how to keep records, how to photograph evidence, how to secure witnesses, how to build a case that couldn't be dismissed. "You're not just writing complaints anymore," she told them. "You're becoming investigators, citizen investigators. This is your town. This is your war effort. You have the right to make sure it's done honestly." They listened with the intensity of soldiers receiving orders before battle, because in a way, that's what they were. This was a different kind of war, but it was war nonetheless. By December, the county had received 34 complaints from Ashford Hollow. The State War Production Board office in Harrisburg took notice. They dispatched a senior investigator, a man named Frederick Dalton, to spend a full week in the town conducting a comprehensive audit. Dalton was thorough. He examined every ledger, interviewed every worker, traced every shipment. He found discrepancies everywhere. Missing honey, unaccounted produce, ration coupons that didn't add up, dairy products diverted from their intended recipients. He couldn't prove criminal activity in every case. The records were too cleverly manipulated, too many gaps filled with plausible explanations. But he could see the pattern, and he could see who benefited. His report was damning. It recommended Elwood Whitmore's immediate suspension pending full investigation, reorganization of the local War Production Board office, and criminal prosecution where evidence supported it. The report was filed in late December 1943. It should have resulted in immediate action. But war bureaucracy moves slowly, and Elwood had friends in Harrisburg. Friends who could delay, obfuscate, bury reports under more urgent matters. January 1944 came and went. Elwood remained in his position, but he was crumbling. The complaints kept coming. His authority was being undermined piece by piece. People who once deferred to him now looked him in the eye. Workers questioned his orders. Farmers demanded receipts. He couldn't sleep. He started drinking heavily. His wife noticed the change, tried to talk to him, but he pushed her away. He hired 2 men from outside the county to serve as bodyguards, claiming he'd received threats. They accompanied him everywhere, silent and watchful. In February, Estelle collapsed during a class. She was standing at the blackboard explaining the proper format for a formal petition when her vision blurred and her legs gave out. Her students rushed to help her, got her into a chair, brought water. "I'm fine," she insisted. "Just tired. Let's continue." But she wasn't fine. The doctor who examined her later that week found her blood pressure dangerously high, her heart irregular. The strain of the past months, the teaching, the organizing, the constant tension, had taken a brutal toll. "You need to rest," the doctor said. "Complete rest. No teaching, no stress." Estelle listened politely and ignored him completely. She held her next class 2 days later. But her students could see the change. She moved more slowly. Her hand trembled when she wrote on the blackboard. Her voice, once strong and clear, sometimes wavered. "You should stop," Luther told her after class one evening. "We can continue without you. You've taught us enough." "It's not enough until it's over," Estelle replied. And it's not over. What she didn't tell them was that she'd started writing a different kind of document. A comprehensive account of everything that had happened. Names, dates, events, evidence. A complete record of Elwood Whitmore's corruption and her campaign against it. She worked on it late into the night, her handwriting growing shakier as exhaustion set in, but never stopping. She knew she might not live to see justice done, but she could make sure the truth survived her. In March 1944, the spring thaw came early. The roads turned to mud, the creeks swelled, and Elwood Whitmore made a mistake. He drove alone one night to Pittsburgh, without his bodyguards, to meet with a black market contact to finalize a large honey sale. The road was dark, winding, treacherous in the mud. His car was found the next morning in a ravine. Elwood was alive but badly injured. Concussion, broken ribs, a shattered collarbone. He claimed someone had forced him off the road, another vehicle that had appeared suddenly and disappeared just as fast. But there were no other tire tracks, no witnesses, no evidence of a second vehicle. The state police investigated. Their conclusion? Driver fell asleep at the wheel, lost control. Accident. Elwood returned to Ashford Hollow a month later, but he was changed. The concussion had affected something crucial. He became forgetful, confused. He'd start sentences and lose the thread. He'd mix up numbers, dates, people's names. He could no longer manage the complex web of corruption he'd built. In June 1944, he was quietly removed from his position. Officially, medical retirement. Unofficially, because he'd become a liability. The new War Production Board coordinator was a young agriculture specialist named Robert Kendrick, 32 years old, honest and energetic. He began cleaning house immediately. He audited records, found shortfalls, pursued accountability. The canning plant supervisor who'd replaced the corrupt one was given full investigative authority. Mabel Hendricks was forced into early retirement. The black market operations collapsed. Honey went where it was supposed to go. Produce reached military distribution. Ration coupons were properly accounted for. But Estelle never saw this complete victory. She taught her last class in late June 1944. She finished the evening's lesson on proper documentation of evidence, dismissed her students, and began putting away her materials. Luther and Agnes stayed behind to help. As Estelle reached for her coat, she swayed. This time, she didn't just collapse. She fell, hitting her head on the desk corner as she went down. There was blood. So much blood. The doctor was summoned. He did what he could, but Estelle's heart was too weak, the head injury too severe. She died 3 days later, never regaining full consciousness. Her funeral filled the Methodist Church to overflowing. People came from surrounding towns, former students spanning 4 decades, farmers and workers who'd learned from her literacy classes. They came to honor a woman who'd taught them more than reading and writing. She'd taught them courage. Harold, her nephew, spoke at the service. He was 47, graying, weathered from farm work. He talked about his aunt, about her integrity, her refusal to accept corruption even when fighting it could kill her. She taught us that silence is a choice, he said, his voice breaking, and that we always have the power to speak. She showed us that one person can make a difference, even if the cost is everything. Elwood Whitmore didn't attend the funeral. He was at home, sitting on his porch wrapped in blankets despite the summer heat, staring at nothing. His wife had left him. His children didn't visit. He was a ghost, breathing but already dead. Sometimes neighbors passing by would hear him muttering to himself, fragments of sentences. Didn't mean, she forced, old witch, should have stopped. He died in the winter of 1945, just as the war in Europe was entering its final months. Heart failure, the death certificate said. His funeral was sparsely attended, but Estelle's grave always had fresh flowers. No one knew who left them, but they appeared every week, even in winter. Years passed. The town changed. The war ended. Young men came home, or didn't. New people arrived, old ones left. But the story of the school teacher who challenged the system remained. It was told to children, grandchildren, passed down like a parable. In 1960, 17 years after her death, Ashford Hollow opened a new school. Large, modern, with a library and gymnasium. They named it in her honor, the Estelle M. Vogel Elementary School. At the dedication ceremony, Harold spoke again. He was in his 60s now, white-haired, his face carved with deep lines. He talked about his aunt, about what she represented. She wasn't just a teacher, he said. She was the conscience of this community. She taught us not just literacy, but integrity. She showed us that one person's courage can light a fire that burns long after they're gone. The crowd listened. Some wept. All remembered. And in the county archives in Harrisburg, in a locked filing cabinet among dusty folders, lay one thin folder. The label read, Quote 10. Inside were 8 of her original complaint letters, never sent past the Ashford Hollow post office, and a memo from an inspector who'd visited the town in fall 1943. The memo stated, Reviewed materials. Find accusations unsubstantiated. Recommend closure without action. Below that was a prosecutor's notation. Underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 12, underscore, underscore, underscore. The folder remained in the archives for many years. Then the archives were reorganized, documents transferred to different facilities. Records were lost, scattered, relegated to forgotten storage rooms. But memory remained. In Ashford Hollow, if you ask the old-timers, they'll tell you about the teacher who taught people not to stay silent. They'll tell you about the coordinator who thought power gave him the right to take. And they'll tell you how it ended. This story is simple and terrible. Terrible not because someone died. Terrible because it shows. The system always protects the system. And to break through that wall, you have to pay. Sometimes with your health, sometimes with your freedom, sometimes with your life. Estelle Vogel paid with her life. But with that price, she bought something important. She bought an example. An example that silence is not mandatory. That you can speak. That you can fight. Even if you're alone. Even if you're old. Even if the odds are impossible. And that example lives on. Somewhere in archives, in dusty boxes, lie her lessons. Notebooks filled with her students' handwriting. Penmanship exercises that were actually instructions for writing complaints. Compositions that taught people to formulate thoughts in ways authority couldn't ignore. These notebooks sit unread. But they exist. They wait. Because history is cyclical. And what happened in 1943 in a Pennsylvania valley can happen anywhere, anytime. When someone takes more than their share. When everyone stays silent. When one person speaks. And then the lesson begins. The lesson Estelle Vogel taught throughout her life and continued even after death. The lesson that truth matters more than fear. That integrity is worth more than life. And that we're all students in this school. The only question is what grade we'll receive when our own test comes. The town of Ashford Hollow continued to grow and change through the decades. The war ended, industries shifted, new highways bypassed the valley, and younger generations moved to cities for opportunities. But certain things remained. The school bearing Estelle's name educated 3 more generations of children. The Methodist Church still held services every Sunday, and people still talked about what happened in 1943. In the 1970s, a researcher from Penn State came to Ashford Hollow to study wartime rationing enforcement in rural Pennsylvania. She interviewed elderly residents, many of whom had been Estelle's students. They told her stories she hadn't found in any official record. About a teacher who weaponized literacy. About students who became citizen investigators. About a corrupt official brought down not by federal agents but by ordinary people armed with nothing but properly formatted letters. The researcher, Dr. Patricia Morgan, included a chapter about Ashford Hollow in her dissertation. She titled it, __quote _13_____. It was dry academic prose, but beneath the scholarly language was a story of extraordinary courage. Dr. Morgan tried to find Estelle's comprehensive account, the document her former students mentioned. But it had disappeared. Perhaps it had been among her effects, lost when her house was sold after her death. Perhaps she'd hidden it somewhere, and it remained hidden still. Or perhaps it had been destroyed by someone who didn't want such a complete record to exist. But pieces survived. In 1982, during renovation of the old schoolhouse that was being converted into a community center, workers found a box of notebooks wedged beneath floorboards in the classroom where Estelle had taught her evening classes. The notebooks contained student exercises from 1943 to 1944. Penmanship drills, spelling tests, composition assignments, and templates. So many templates. How to address county supervisors, how to structure an appeal to state authorities, how to document evidence, how to build an argument that couldn't be dismissed, how to make your voice heard when the system wanted you silent. The notebooks were donated to the County Historical Society. They were cataloged, preserved, and largely forgotten. Until 2008, when a high school student named Jennifer Blackwell chose them for a National History Day project. She scanned the pages, transcribed the exercises, recognized what they really were. Her project, titled __quote _14____, won the state competition and placed 3rd nationally. Jennifer's grandmother had been one of Estelle's evening students. Her name was Stella Pritchard, the woman who'd noticed the ration coupon discrepancies. Stella was 94 when Jennifer interviewed her for the project, living in a nursing home in Harrisburg, her mind still sharp despite her frail body. She taught us more than how to write, Stella told her granddaughter. her voice thin but fierce. She taught us that we mattered, that our words had power, that we didn't have to accept whatever those in charge decided to do. She made us understand that being ordinary people didn't mean being powerless people. Jennifer asked, "Were you afraid?" Stella smiled. Terrified. Every time I mailed a letter, I thought Elwood would come after me, thought I'd lose my job, or worse. But I was more afraid of what I'd become if I stayed silent. Miss Vogel showed us that fear is a choice. You can choose courage instead. Did you know she was risking her life? Stella's smile faded. We suspected. We could see how tired she was getting, how much the stress was costing her. Some of us asked her to stop. She refused, said the work was more important than one old woman's health. We should have insisted. We should have protected her, but she wouldn't let us. Do you think it was worth it? Jennifer asked gently. What she sacrificed? Stella was quiet for a long moment. Then, every day I live in a world where people know they can speak up against corruption. I think it was worth it. Every time someone files a complaint and gets justice, I think it was worth it. Every time a child learns they have rights and the power to defend them, I think it was worth it. Not because I'm glad she died. I wish every day she'd lived to see 90, 100, had the peaceful retirement she deserved. But she made a choice, and that choice changed things, changed us, made us better. So yes, it was worth it. Not because death is good, but because what she bought with her death continues to live. Jennifer included this interview in her project. The judges praised it for bringing history alive through personal testimony. But more importantly, it reminded people that history isn't just about dates and documents. It's about choices, courage, consequences. In 2015, the County Board of Supervisors issued a posthumous commendation to Estelle Vogel for quote, _15_____. The commendation was presented to Harold's daughter, Estelle's great-niece, in a ceremony at the county courthouse. The current board chairman read from Estelle's original complaint letters, which had been retrieved from the archives for the occasion. The precision of her language is remarkable, the chairman said. The clarity of her evidence, the strength of her argument. These are masterworks of civic writing. They should be taught in every composition class as examples of how citizens communicate with their government. What he didn't say, but what everyone present understood, was that these letters had been deliberately buried for decades. That the system Estelle had challenged had tried to erase not just her complaints, but her very existence as a challenger, and had failed. The elementary school bearing her name underwent major renovation in 2018. As part of the project, a bronze plaque was installed in the main entrance. It quoted Estelle's own words from a letter to the county board dated September 15, 1943. I write not as a troublemaker, but as a citizen who believes that those entrusted with public service must be held to the highest standards of honesty and accountability. To remain silent in the face of corruption is to become complicit in it. Therefore I speak. Therefore I act. Therefore I insist that you do the same. Below the quote, Estelle Vogel, 1876 to 1944. Teacher, citizen, voice of conscience. Students entering the school each morning pass this plaque. Some pause to read it. Some have heard the story from parents or grandparents. Others learn it in 5th grade, when local history is part of the curriculum. All of them absorb, whether consciously or not, the lesson that one person's courage can matter. In 2020, during a period of intense national discussion about accountability and institutional corruption, several news outlets rediscovered Estelle's story. Articles appeared in Pennsylvania newspapers, then in regional magazines, finally in a national publication. The teacher who fought wartime corruption with perfect grammar, read one headline. One woman's war on the home front, read another. The stories resonated. People shared them on social media, drew parallels to contemporary issues, debated whether such individual action could still make a difference in modern bureaucratic systems. Some argued that Estelle's success was a product of her time, that today's institutions are too large, too interconnected, too powerful for one person to challenge. Others insisted that the principles remain valid: documentation, persistence, courage, and the power of the written word used skillfully. What the articles mostly missed, because it wasn't easily reducible to sound bites, was the full cost. Estelle didn't just work hard and then retire to enjoy her victory. She worked herself to death. She sacrificed her health, her final years, her chance at peace. She made that choice knowing the likely outcome. That's the part of the story that's harder to celebrate, harder to package as inspiration. It's the tragic part. The part that asks, should change require such sacrifice? Is a system that demands martyrs worth defending? But perhaps the better question is, given that systems resist change, given that power protects itself, given that corruption doesn't surrender willingly, what choice did she have? Remain silent and safe but complicit? Or speak knowing the cost? Estelle chose to speak, and that choice echoes. In Ashford Hollow today, population now just over 400, the physical landscape has changed. The old War Production Board office is now a florist shop. The post office is a branch of a regional chain, automated and impersonal. The canning plant closed in the 1980s. The building was demolished to make way for a small shopping plaza. The apiaries are gone, victims of colony collapse disorder and commercial consolidation. But the Methodist Church still stands. The cemetery where Estelle is buried remains well maintained. Her grave sits on a hillside overlooking the valley, beneath an oak tree that was young when she died and is ancient now. The headstone is simple granite, engraved with her name, dates, and one word: teacher. Fresh flowers still appear there, though less regularly than in earlier years. Sometimes they're left by descendants of her students, sometimes by teachers from the elementary school bearing her name, who bring their classes on field trips to learn about local history. Sometimes by strangers who've heard the story and felt moved to pay respects. And sometimes, this is whispered more than confirmed, the flowers appear with no explanation at all, as though the land itself remembers and honors what happened here. The notebooks found beneath the schoolhouse floorboards are now digitized. They're available online through the County Historical Society's website. Researchers can access them. Students can study them. Anyone curious about the intersection of literacy education and civic action can examine them page by page. What's striking, reading through them now, is how ordinary they seem at first glance. Penmanship exercises. __quote _21__. Spelling tests. __quote _22__. Grammar drills. __quote _23__. But look closer, and the pattern emerges. Every exercise, every assignment, every drill is designed to build a specific skill set. The skill set needed to document wrongdoing, articulate grievances, and demand accountability from those in power. Estelle was teaching guerrilla civics. She was turning literacy into weaponry, grammar into ammunition, composition into strategy. And she did it so subtly, so cleverly, that her students often didn't realize what they were learning until they needed to use it. One notebook, belonging to Luther Finch, contains this note in the margin of an exercise on formal letter structure. Use this today. Sent complaint about honey. Hope it works. Thank you, Miss Fee. Another, belonging to Agnes Holloway, has this notation. Practice makes perfect. Sent 5th letter today. Getting easier. Your lessons matter. A third, from a student identified only as TW, contains this. Scared every time, but do it anyway. You taught us that's what courage is. These marginal notes, these small testimonies, reveal the real curriculum. Estelle wasn't just teaching composition. She was teaching defiance. She was showing people that the system could be challenged, that authority could be questioned, that justice could be demanded. and she was showing them that ordinary people, using nothing but words arranged properly and persistently, could accomplish what seemed impossible. In 2023, a drama teacher at Estelle Vogel Elementary School adapted the story into a play for the school's annual production. Letters from the Valley premiered in the school auditorium to a packed house. Fifth graders played the adult evening students. Sixth graders portrayed Elwood Whitmore and his associates. And a retired teacher, brought in specially for the role, played Estelle. The play didn't shy from the difficult parts. It showed Estelle's decline, her exhaustion, her ultimate collapse. It showed Elwood's corruption and his paranoia-driven destruction. It showed ordinary people finding courage they didn't know they had and paying prices they hadn't anticipated. The final scene recreated Estelle's last class. She stands at the blackboard, chalk in her trembling hand, and addresses her students. "What I've taught you," she says, "isn't just about writing letters. It's about understanding that you have value, that your voice matters, that the powerful aren't powerful because they're better than you. They're powerful because they've convinced you to stay quiet. But you don't have to be quiet. You can speak. You can write. You can demand. You can insist. And when enough people do that, when enough voices join together, even the most entrenched corruption can't stand." She pauses, sways slightly, steadies herself. "I may not live to see all the changes we're fighting for, but you will. You'll live to see a time when accountability isn't radical, it's routine. When transparency isn't dangerous, it's expected. When demanding honesty from those in power isn't an act of courage, it's an act of citizenship. That's what we're building, letter by letter, word by word, together." The stage lights dim. The scene ends. In the audience, elderly residents who remembered the real events wiped their eyes. Younger viewers who'd only known the story as history felt it become personal. And children, watching their classmates embody a struggle from 80 years ago, learned that courage isn't about being unafraid. It's about being afraid and acting anyway. After the performance, the drama teacher led a discussion. She asked the students what they'd learned from researching and performing the play. Their answers varied but shared common themes: persistence, justice, sacrifice, responsibility. One fifth grader, playing the role of Luther Finch, said, quote, 29 quote. A sixth grader who'd played Elwood Whitmore said, "I learned that having power doesn't make you right, and that if you use power to hurt people, eventually it comes back on you." The retired teacher who'd portrayed Estelle said, underscore, underscore, quote, underscore, 31 underscore, underscore. The play ran for 3 performances. It was filmed and archived. It became part of the school's tradition, performed every 5 years to new generations of students. And in this way, Estelle's lesson continued to be taught. Not just in history books or academic papers, but in lived experience. In students embodying the struggle, feeling the weight of the choices, understanding viscerally what courage costs. The story of Ashford Hollow, 1943, is not a simple story of good versus evil. Elwood Whitmore wasn't a monster. He was a man who saw an opportunity and took it, who rationalized his corruption as pragmatism, who convinced himself that everyone did it so he might as well too. He was ordinary in his failings. That's what made him dangerous. And Estelle wasn't a saint. She was a stubborn old woman who couldn't let go, who perhaps cared more about being right than about self-preservation, who pushed herself and others toward a confrontation that might have been avoided with more diplomacy or patience. Her absolutism was both her strength and her flaw. But the collision between them created something larger than either of them. It created a moment when the ordinary people of a small town realized they had agency, that they could act, that they could change things. Not easily, not without cost, but they could. And that realization, once seated, grows. It spreads. It endures. Today, if you file a complaint with a government agency, if you report misconduct, if you demand accountability from those in power, you're participating in a process that people like Estelle Vogel fought to make routine. What feels mundane now, The ability to question authority without being destroyed for it was once revolutionary, was once dangerous, was once worth dying for. We forget that. We take it for granted, until we're reminded, through stories like this, that nothing is automatic, that every right, every protection, every avenue for redress was won by someone's struggle, someone's sacrifice. Estelle's grave sits quiet on its hillside. The flowers still come, though the people who leave them are mostly gone now too. The oak tree provides shade. Birds nest in its branches. Seasons change. But the words she taught her students to write, words demanding justice, insisting on accountability, refusing to accept corruption as inevitable, those words continue to echo. In every formal complaint filed by a citizen, in every letter to an elected official demanding action, in every instance when someone documents wrongdoing and says, "This is not acceptable," the lesson continues, the test continues, and we are all, still, Estelle Vogel's students. The question remains, what will we do with what she taught us? Will we write our letters? Will we stand our ground? Will we pay the price if required? Or will we stay silent, comfortable, complicit? Ashford Hollow can't answer that for us. Estelle's sacrifice can't answer that for us. Only we can answer. Through our choices, through our actions, through the words we write or refuse to write. The lesson is taught, has been taught, will always be taught. But the student must choose whether to learn.